Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining the presentation about Zero Trust. My name is Nicholas. I'm a systems architect for Fortinet Federal. I've been doing network architecture and infrastructure for about 10 years now in the federal space, going from operations all the way up to engineering and architecture. So this presentation, this is the second time I've been doing this presentation. I did this last year as well. We had a good turnout and it seemed well received. So hopefully I can provide some information that can help you guys on your Zero Trust journey. This is going to be a more technical presentation, so it's going to be more about what are we doing at the infrastructure hardware level as opposed to necessarily policy driven. So just a forewarning on that. So the overall agenda, as far as we're going to be setting the scene, right? So we're going to talk about why we need Zero Trust, where we are today, and where we need to go. We're going to define what Zero Trust is, as well as Zero Trust architecture, which is a little bit different. And then we're going to talk about how we can leverage some of the newer technologies that have recently come out, such as AI, to help us achieve our mission. As you know, implementing Zero Trust is a largely manpower-intensive task, right? So what tools can we use to drive that to completion? And we're going to talk about behavioral analytics and threat intelligence as well, some of the things that we already do today, but how we can enhance those and bring those into our journey. And then we're just going to go over the key components of the architecture. We'll talk about like firewalls, switching infrastructure, what we do at those layers to facilitate Zero Trust, and then how we can integrate Zero Trust into our existing infrastructure. So today, traditional network architecture is largely a castle-based architecture, right? When you get onto the network, you have inherent trust on that device. You're able to access whatever resources you want at potentially a layer 3 level. You may have macro-segmentation, different layer 3 boundaries, but ultimately, if you're not implementing Zero Trust, users are able to access whatever resource they can reach via layer 3. Obviously, the user doesn't necessarily know that, but if a malicious actor were to get onto the network, they'd have much more free roam to what they can attack and exfiltrate data from. So, our primary focus today is what can we do on our firewalls, maybe do a little layer 7 inspection, DPAC inspection, what have you. Other than that, may not be doing much else. And we may not even have any automation help us in this task. Securing large enterprise networks take a lot of manpower, and you need to also have a way to automatically respond to threats if they're found on the network. You may not have a large overnight SOC that's monitoring 24/7. You may only have a few people. So having that extra manpower and using the tools of automation to help us achieve our objectives is critical. So it's mainly a problem today is because our organizations are changing, especially with the advent of COVID and the era after that, right? We have a lot of remote work, a lot of telework. We have more devices being onboarded onto the network as opposed to back in the day, we just have our users in our office, maybe a couple remote workers. So our castle is now, we have assets everywhere. We have cloud, right? The advent of cloud, more attack surface, more locations that we need to protect. As well as, bring your own device. Some organizations are also allowing their employees to bring their own device to the network. They may secure it, they may put AV on it and kind of control it from that perspective, but overall our attack surface is growing. So how do we solve this? Right, so at the most basic level, Zero Trust is never trust anything and always verify what's connected to your network, right? It's not really a singular product. It's not something you can just go buy and say, hey, I'm going to put a Zero Trust appliance in my network and I'm doing Zero Trust. It's both policy and technology driven. So it's also a mindset, right? We need all our users to also be conscious of our Zero Trust effort. And we'll kind of get into that when we talk about the Zero Trust model next. Zero Trust necessarily isn't something new. It's a very large buzzword, but you may be doing Zero Trust today just inherently through your switching infrastructure, port security, things like that. So zero trust architecture is actually how we implement zero trust within our IT infrastructure boundary and how we do that at a technological level. So some of the things that entail in that is limiting access, right? Who can connect to the network, who can access what resources, doing least privilege, right? We don't want to give our users access to admin credential level access. We also want to verify and assess what these users are connecting to and who they are, and if they need to actually be connecting to it. And we also need knowledge of what's happening on the network, who's accessing what, why are they accessing it, do they need to be accessing it, where are they accessing it from, are they a remote teleworker, or are they on site, and when are they doing it? Are they accessing it at 3 in the morning? That might be a little suspicious. It might indicate some compromise on that user's account. So overall, we have the zero trust architecture pillar, right? And I put the DoD version because that's what you guys are ultimately using, and it's based off NIST 800-207, but it goes a little more in granular depth of how we implement this and drive our zero trust journey. So some of the key areas, we have our users, of course, our people who are using the network, the devices, which is what they're using to access the network, what other devices we have, fire alarms, door lock security, things like that. Applications and workloads, right? We have a lot of custom home-built applications that may need to be protected as well. And the data that those applications and workloads produce and the data that the users are housing on their devices. And then our network infrastructure. That's really important because that's how we tie everything together. That's how all our servers can communicate to each other, and that's how our users get access to the resources. And then we'll kind of talk about the automation and orchestration. How can we make our lives easier as administrators, engineers, architects, operations, right? How can we save man hours to dedicate them to other tasks such as growing our cloud infrastructure or securing other aspects of the network? And then visibility and analytics, right? It's really important that you have visibility into what is happening so that you can take that information and allow your tools to properly combat your threats. If you don't know what's going on, how can you stop something? So the DoD zero trust model, and this is kind of just if you're not too familiar with it, most of you are, but it's specifically tailored for DoD and military, right? Based off NIST 800-207. NIST 800-207 zero trust model is a little more, there's a lot of overlap between the two, except the DoD one has a little more in-depth granularity on how we're going to implement our zero trust architecture, which accelerates our journey because we need everyone to be on board when we're implementing our plan, right? So this is more of a non-technical avenue of zero trust. It's like, how do we get everyone on board to meet our mission's objective? And we can do that through multiple different ways: doctrine, organizational methods, procedures, policies. We could do training. We can post materials such as pamphlets on our walls telling everyone, hey, make sure you're adhering to our zero trust policies and procedures that we have put into place. So now we'll get into more of the technical aspects, kind of, what we're looking at from each part of the model and how it relates to a technical category. So for users, we want to obviously build strict authentication authorization schemes so that the users are only accessing whatever they're required to access and nothing more. That's part of the whole least privilege, making sure that we also have multifactor authentication so that if an account is compromised, as you know, there's many breaches and whatnot of user credentials, or users like to reuse the same passwords all over the place. So having multi-factor authentication can really reduce our attack surface if a user account was compromised. And then more recently with Zero Trust, it's more about per session authentication and authorization. When someone's accessing something, have their credentials changed since then? Has the account been compromised since the initial access, right? They just log in today and it's like, okay, you have unfettered access to the network. But what if, their machine was infected with malware and then they're still able to access those resources, right? So that's more of why we would go to a per session authentication and authorization method. So this really asks the who's accessing our network and why. So we have device principles, right? And that's about ensuring that the devices that our users are connecting with are secure. So we want to make sure that we're inventorying what applications the users have, if they have authorized applications, whether their antivirus is up to date, whatever UTM features that we have to protect our users, Unified Threat Management, that those are actually up to date and functioning properly. And then, the validity of each device is the user just bringing their laptop in from home and plugging it right into the wall, and they have full access without any controls on that. We want to minimize that and reduce incidents that way. So are they legitimate? Is someone coming in and plugging a spoof device in there that's attacking your infrastructure? We need to know that information. And then the behavior, obviously, this also ties into analytics to see what data and where these devices are accessing, whether they're accessing the resources that they should, or they're trying to do a port scan across your whole network. You definitely want to be able to have insight and visibility into that. So application and workload, this is a little more on the programmatic side, like programmers and things like that. So as you know, we have many APIs. Programmers write APIs. They sometimes put like API keys in the public directory, and next thing you know, someone has scrubbed your web page and they have credentials to access your system. So it's really important that we monitor these API calls and what applications are accessing, right? And see if those, making sure our front-facing interface towards the internet or whatever public domain we have, that we're securing that. And then, we only want to allow what's necessary for our services to actually function. We want to make sure that our applications that we are creating and writing for our business and enterprise are secure, as well as having the functionality required to conduct business. Also want to segment applications from each other. So this is more of containing your attack surface, right? If one application gets compromised, you don't want it to be able to attack another application just because they inherently trust each other. And then immutable workflows. So say we're sending our application over the internet or some other untrusted network, right? We want to make sure that those workflows and that data cannot be messed with in transit, right? It's immutable. So that, whether we do that through security, SSL, IPsec, whatever have you to secure your application, we need to ensure that we're adhering to those principles. And then, our data, the most important, I would say one of the most important parts of our enterprise is, all our data, without it, we wouldn't really have anything. If someone went and deleted all our databases, we would have nothing, right? We'd have to start from scratch. So all our research, all our top secret information, everything, that needs to be secured as priority. So obviously, need to know access. You don't want someone accessing information that they don't really need to know and potentially exfiltrating that, especially if a user account were to become compromised. Making sure that we actually secure the data by encrypting that at rest and in transit so that it, once again, cannot be tampered with, ensuring the validity of that. Classifications and marking of data. This would also, tie into users sharing data. If they were sending an email, making sure that our data is properly classified so they cannot send a top secret email out to someone who's not in your domain. And then limiting and monitoring who's actually sending what. You kind of want to keep a log of, hey, did John in accounting send off some invoice that had proprietary information or something along those lines, and now a threat actor has more information on our organization, how they can attack us, create more phishing campaigns, whatever the mind desires. And then data inventorying, what information do we have, what's its classification, where does it rest, are we actually securing it properly or not? We need to know these things. So for our networking environment, this is more talking about like what we're doing at the infrastructure level, right? So a lot of these principles all tie in together. Secure communications, so here we're encrypting our data at transit wherever we can. If we have multiple site locations, we want to do IPsec between sites, making sure that when potentially a branch office talks to another one, that their data is encrypted and not visible. Controlling who comes onto the network. So this would be more network onboarding, like network access control. We have a system in play to say, hey, if you plug your device into port XYZ on our switch, are your devices compliant with our organization's policies? And then minimum required access at the network level. Do devices really need intra-VLAN connectivity, or can they be segmented off so that they can only talk to the default gateway and nothing else? This reduces essentially our threat surface, because if you segment your network at a micro level, devices aren't able to hop across and talk to each other, thus they're not able to attack other devices and move forward laterally. And this also entails software-defined networking, which really isn't a security focus, but it is mentioned under the pillars, right? So software-defined networking, more along the lines of, hey, is our data being sent in the most efficient way, and are we utilizing our WAN links more effectively? So these, the network principles kind of talk about where and when. Automation and orchestration, so this is essential because without automation, we're not going to be able to respond to threats as fast, right? If you just go back to the SOC example, if you have one SOC engineer working in the middle of the night, as opposed to during the day, you're going to have limited workforce. So you need automation so that that one SOC analyst can go ahead and respond to threats in an effective manner as if there were 5 other people on the team, as well as making sure that those responses don't inadvertently bring down your environment. So this gives us a more cohesive response to any threats that we deem. And in this case, right, we have our analytics and AI feeding data into our automation so that the response can be more proper. And it may even see things that the human can't, right? It's looking at signatures and patterns. We may miss something, but with the additional tools, that'll help us have a more thorough coverage. So AI, this is more of an emerging technology, right? This just recently came up in the last couple of years. It became a hot topic. With all our new governance, our new technical requirements, that creates a lot of demand for labor, especially when we're implementing our zero trust, right? We may need to go refresh some of our hardware, change some of our security policies, reconfigure devices, re-educate users. So that increases a personnel burden. We may not be able to double our staff to meet these goals, and if we do, then when we're done, we don't necessarily need that workforce anymore, so that may not turn out so well. So if we can take AI and leverage that to enhance our zero trust journey, for example, we could say, what would be the recommended approach for implementing XYZ policy? What would be the recommended approach for responding to XYZ threat? And then feeding that into the rest of our infrastructure and automation tools. And it'll also help us increase our rate of how we're actually identifying threats, whether we're missing something, as I alluded to earlier, or we actually are responding to everything that we should be. And then, visibility analytics, this ties everything together, because if you can't see what's going on at your network, you really can't secure it. If you don't know what's talking to what, why is it talking to what, when is it talking to what, how are you going to write a policy, a security policy to secure those assets? So we need proper visibility analytics to make sure that our response is actually accurate. We need to tie that in with our automation as well. And we need to have it so that we can plan how to accurately represent our system to the rest of the network. The knowledge of every action performed on the network is also essential because, again, users can't be running off with our data, sending it off via personal email, sending it their personal email, plugging USB sticks in, and giving it to who knows who. And then we can also use this data, right, to, if we're being inspected or we have a compliance coming up, a compliance inspection, we need to be able to make sure, hey, we know where everything is, we know what's talking to what, we have visibility on every portion of the network, we meet your compliance requirements, and here's the data to support that. And it's especially true in the federal space. So, along the lines of the visibility analytics, it's more about what devices do we have on our infrastructure, what applications are we housing, what identities do we have, who's connected to what, have we maybe went and looked at our identity management system and seen if there were users that necessarily don't work here anymore, have those databases been updated so that we don't, if there's a breach and your employee got purged 3 years ago and now they're somehow logging in, we need to make sure that we're logging that down. And device and network management. Are the devices on our network, have they always been there? Are they all accounted for? Who can access what? Is that accounted for? And this all goes back into the ensuring that our integrity of our devices, and by having visibility of that, we can ensure that we can apply the proper policies. So this is more about knowing who, what, where, when, why, and being able to document that and have information of who's doing what. So threat intelligence, right? We may not see all the threats in the world in our sole organization, so we might need to go to third-party resources to acquire this data, other companies, threat feeds, other organizations within our, essentially, space, right? How can we feed that threat intelligence into our automation to provide a more cohesive threat response, right? If we only have a small subset of what can attack us within our automation tools, how can we respond properly to everything? So sharing information, sharing threat intelligence between organizations is very critical to this. So we can either gain that internally or externally. There's many different threat feeds available, many different organizations that are all participating in sharing threat intelligence. And how can we take these data points and feed them into our system? What IPs should we block? What URLs should we be disallowing our users to connect to? Are the URLs brand new and they just came up a day ago? They might be doing something a little malicious. We need to find that information. So being able to share the data between all our organizations is critical for Zero Trust. So we'll go over the architecture components, so at a more device-based level, what we're doing and why we're doing it. So we have identity access management, network access control, endpoint protection, firewalls, and our switching infrastructure. And all these are going to work together to provide that cohesive, unified threat management system so that we can respond to our threats properly. So for identity access and management, this is our user credentials, who's accessing what, authentication, authorization, radius, SAML, single sign-on. In Zero Trust, we want to periodically challenge the user to re-authenticate, is allowing them to just sign in once and then they're done with it, right? If their account became compromised at the time, we will need to challenge that. Like, okay, well, you need to re-authenticate to make sure you are who you say you are. As well as enforcing authentication authorization on all our applications, making sure that we don't have service accounts that have unlimited access and they're easily attacked, right? Making sure that we have strong passwords for those. Two-factor authentication, as I discussed earlier, with all the breaches and whatnot, having a single form of authentication isn't secure. If passwords people like to reuse passwords, right? It's common to them, they'll put them on a sticky note, slap it somewhere. Sticky note may get lost, they won't think anything of it. Someone picks up that sticky note sometime later and, hey, what do you know? They have access to their account. So that extra two-factor authentication, whether that be an app on your phone or a physical token, what have you, that's really important to our overall mission. And then devices that are coming onto our network, we need to make sure that those are authenticated properly, whether they're doing 802.1x or some other form of radius authentication, making sure that the user is got the proper device and that the device is actually compliant with our policy. So in the diagram, I just have a user. He's trying to access multiple different resources, and he's requested to authenticate for each separate resource. So it's not a, hey, I've signed in, I have access to everything. It's more granular. I have access to X, Y, Z, but not 1, 2, 3. Network access control. So this is more focused on our devices that are connecting to the network, what their posture is, whether they have the proper authentication authorization, whether they have the proper AV programs, what they can access applied to their network port. So this is mainly talking about like 802.1x, for example, making sure that user XYZ, once he authenticates and authorizes, his device is compliant with our policy that we put in place, whether he's got the right patches, his AV's up to date, making sure that there's no vulnerable programs on the machine before they actually connect. Or if there is vulnerable programs, that we give them a chance to go ahead and remediate those vulnerabilities so that they still get access, but now our attack surface has been reduced. And then collecting telemetry from these devices that are onboarded, making sure that we have, this ties in with the analytics portion of it, making sure that we have the data saying, hey, this user, he necessarily wasn't compliant before, he got all patched up, and now he's good to go. And that we have logs of that. So endpoint protection, sometimes the endpoint protection also ties in with NAC, right? They could be sometimes the same program, sometimes different. Making sure that this is the program that's actually going to be securing your endpoint, right? It's going to do the posture checking, compliance checking, making sure that the software on the computer is valid, it's up to date, but also making sure that the devices, if they become infected, that we need to remediate those as soon as possible and potentially even stop that device from accessing resources. So this kind of goes back to the other session example that I gave. If a user is connecting, say he's doing session A, right, we allow that, his computer was fine, he opens up another web browser, downloads something malicious, and now he's not necessarily fine anymore, right? We need to put him in a remediation and deny him from accessing resources on our network. Responding to threats or attempts to exfiltrate data, we need to stop users from taking sensitive information such as in a Word doc and sending it off via email or uploading it to a USB stick and then running off with it. And then enabling, administrators to see which devices are vulnerable within their network. Our endpoint protection system combined with our NAC system is going to give the admins visibility into that to see, okay, user Jim, right, he's good to go. His machine necessarily wasn't good to go, so maybe we need to, give some training to him and making sure that he doesn't click on stuff, install programs that he should not necessarily be installing. We could also take our analytics and take that and be like, here's a list of users who may need more remedial training. So firewalls, everyone's familiar with what a firewall does, hopefully. If you're not, essentially, your layer 3 boundary, right, you're able to inspect packets and provide essentially UTM features to your network. You're enforcing traffic segmentation at a layer 3 to 7 level, so you could do deep packet inspection. You could say, hey, this subnet should not be talking to google.com or getting DNS from Google, it should be using an internal resource, so let's go ahead and block that. It's also going to provide us encryption, right? If we're doing site-to-site, or if we're doing an SD-WAN deployment where we have a hub and spoke, we want to make sure that all our branches and hubs, that when they talk to each other, that they're properly encrypting the data that they send along. Inspecting the inbound and outbound traffic. This is where we get our information from, who's talking to what, why are they talking to it. We may need to go inspect that and look at the data and be like, okay, well, we just had someone plug in a device. They started talking to some IP in some foreign country. Now we can go either block that in real time or go remediate that device on the network. And then protecting our public and internal resources. This is pretty straightforward, such as if we had an application that's internet facing, we want to make sure that we are blocking, probing attempts, making sure that internet traffic isn't able to scan our network. As you know, anything you plug in the internet usually it's already being scanned for vulnerabilities and threats, so making sure that we block that traffic from even coming in before it hits that device and potentially become compromised. We may have a DMZ in our network where we provide external services that may be a little more insecure, that we need to open up more ports, more traffic flows to allow our business to function. And that's where we would do it at the firewall level. And then gathering our telemetry data. So again, these could be in the form of reports, session information, all stored in our analytics server, which then we can use to reinforce our posture. So switching, this is a little more basic. This is more about the layer 2 boundary, creating our layer 3, right? If we have a layer 3 switch, we're doing VLANs, private VLANs, segmenting out our layer 2 infrastructure so that we consolidate our domains. Usually our switching infrastructure also could talk to our firewall, right? It really depends on which kind of products you're using. It's the first line of defense. It's essentially what the user's plugging into. They're plugging into a jack in the wall and gaining access to the network. This is where we'll be applying 802.1x, ties into our authentication authorization schemes, also ties into our network access control where our device is now being fingerprinted by our NAC system, ensuring that you're not plugging a printer into a port that may necessarily be allotted for a computer. Someone comes in and brings their printer into the office and plugs it in, you want to block that. So all these systems work in conjunction to permit and deny who's accessing what devices are on our network, and if they should even be allowed to connect. So to summarize, right, Zero Trust is not a product that we can just go buy. It's not something that I can sell you. I can't sell you Zero Trust. I can't say, hey, if you buy this today, you're gonna be good to go. It doesn't work like that. It's more about how we're implementing our policies, what sort of governance we're providing to our users, what sort of training that we're administering to achieve our objective. Zero Trust architecture is the implementation of Zero Trust, how we're building our architecture to meet the Zero Trust journey. So this may be, different network architectures, different policy architectures. All this is under the umbrella of Zero Trust architecture. Combining multiple solutions to provide a coherent defense in depth architecture. So we have multiple layers of protection that an adversary would need to get past to actually have access to classified or protected resources. Trust nothing and always verify. So this is really important because if we just allow the users to inherently access everything, authenticate only once and never revalidate that the user is actually who they are, who they say they are, what device they have, and if that device is actually supposed to be accessing the network, then we're not really doing Zero Trust. We're back to what we were originally doing where we just have our simple network and we're just doing basic security on that. And then, the important point to this is making sure that we are utilizing the technologies that are available to us today with the limited resources we have to achieve our end goal and secure our enterprises. So, have some contact information here for you guys. If you guys would like to find out more about Fortinet Federal, you can send an email, call us. This presentation was not a vendor-specific presentation. You guys could go apply this to your networks today using the concepts. But I appreciate the time, and we can get into some questions. If anyone has any questions. If you could come up to the microphone, please.
So you had like in the brief like a data pillar.
Yeah.
But I didn't see that. I didn't see that in your architecture. Can you talk to like some of the tools and technologies out there for securing your data, and then how is Fortinet incorporating that?
So the data principles was covered. So that was, you were asking, I showed data within the diagram, right? It showed all the pillars. As far as like the data, so this slide covers the data principles. There was not necessarily a technological implementation of that within this slide, but that would be more of, at the OS level, ensuring that our data is encrypted, like on a server, ensuring that our data in transit is being protected. That would be done at like the firewall level. So those were kind of split up between the two. Hopefully that answered your question.
Okay, it's on. Cornell Gallicay from BAE, and a question for you, sir, is this has been a really good presentation. Since we're not implementing this at like some corporate level or base level per se, we're trying to make this happen at the Army enterprise level. Who are the right points of contacts? Because we're not really seeing every base go out there and do this for yourself. We're trying to do this at a higher level, I hope, right? Because I need my identity management figured out as the Army. I need device identities kind of figured out as the Army, and it's currently not consistently deployed, right? On top of that, we're using shared data at large data centers, right? And I know we didn't get to do policies today, but policy is going to be a big deal because we need to actually map people to say what resources do you have access to, what workflows can you do. That's really a heavy lift. And without knowing all the apps and how people need to be mapped, those policies are going to be really difficult. So there's a lot of higher level enterprise kind of data and infrastructure in some sense that's necessary. And who do you think are the right people that we should be talking to make sure that we're not trying to all reinvent the wheel individually at the lower level, instead working as one enterprise kind of framework?
Yeah, so the question is essentially, how do we get multiple organizations to work together is what you're getting at. So that's going to be making sure that the like CTO level officers are all in communication and that they're allowing and encouraging their teams to openly share information amongst the organizations so that each organization can have the proper policy, as you mentioned. So that's more of, we all need to work together to achieve the zero trust architecture and zero trust journey, but we're going to need help. If you have that many, open flows that need to be secured, and it's more, everyone's tightly integrated, it definitely needs to be additional teamwork and getting all the engineering teams, systems admins, everyone on the same page of what we're doing so we can have a cohesive response in terms of, we may not have a blanket response that applies to everyone, but we're able to tailor individual policies. If we have a connection to organization A, right, that our policies meet those requirements and that it's proper for that organization to access our data. So that's more of, hey, we need to go to the highest levels that we can of our technological community and workforce and get everyone on board from the top down. Good question. Anything else? Sorry, I'll go back to your question. As far as Fortinet, since this was a vendor agnostic presentation, we definitely can help out with that, but I'm not recommending anything at this time. So hopefully, hopefully this helps you guys out on your zero trust journey. As I mentioned, this was a more technical presentation as opposed to writing policy and whatnot. So a little bit different than most presentations you hear about zero trust. So hopefully I helped some of you guys and kind of unravel what your infrastructure teams are doing, or if you're an infrastructure engineer or another IT personnel, that it kind of gives you some ideas of how you can go implement zero trust within your environment today.